Recording this session, we're going to do two chapters and we're going to do it quick. One is a discussion on monopoly, and in general, we have what we call market structure. This is the environment in which firms operate, and we had already discussed one end of the spectrum, which was perfect competition or very competitive market. This was characterized by many buyers and sellers and identical products, and so that essentially means that sellers are price takers, because if there are so many sellers, nobody can influence the market, so the market dictates what they have to accept, so therefore they become price takers. Identical product basically means that the consumer have infinite number of choices. Everybody sells exactly the same thing, so therefore that led to a perfectly elastic demand curve, which is the price, meaning that at this price any particular seller, they can sell as many as they have available, but they cannot influence the market price. The market price is determined through interaction of supply and demand by all sellers and all buyers, and the result is the equilibrium price. This equilibrium price has to be accepted by individual sellers, and since there are so many sellers, nobody can influence the market. Products are identical, consumers have unlimited choices or many choices, and therefore they're extremely price sensitive. That leads to this horizontal demand curve. Then you go to a little bit to the right of this situation where you end up with what we call monopolistic competitive. In this case, still there are a relatively large number of sellers, but there is product differentiation. Meaning that each seller sells similar but different product, but slightly different product. So fast food is an example. Everybody has a hamburger, french fries, and a drink, but some have a different size of the package, some have different flavor, the decor and ambiance might be different, etc., etc., etc. So products are similar but differentiated either in quality, quantity, or some other attributes. If nothing else, just a logo. You can actually, and now in this case, there are some barrier to enter, but it's not humongous. Anybody can open up a hamburger joint across the street from McDonald's, more or less. So therefore, and they can stop the next week if the business is not good. They can close down and go away. So similar to competitive market, their entry and exit of the market is relatively easy. There are not much of a restrictions, but nonetheless there's a product differentiation, which means that they are entering the world of price setting. And that's where monopolistic comes, because if you are unique in some way, however small or insignificant uniqueness, you're monopolistic. Maybe your flavor, maybe the name of your sandwich, Big Mac, Burger King cannot copy it, or Wendy's cannot copy it, etc. In that case, you're monopolistic, but also you're competitive because you sell something similar to many others. So is a little bit to the right of perfectly competitive through product differentiation, but because of uniqueness of the products, then the seller can set the price, so become price setter. McDonald's can sell its products any way it wants to. It may not sell a whole lot if it price itself out of the marketplace. Let's say a package of sandwich would be $12 where everybody else charges 7, but nonetheless they can do so. At the end of the day, there may be differences of 50 cents or a dollar for the same package between as one seller to the other. And so in that case, the demand curve is no longer horizontal. The demand curve is downward sloping, which means that you can set the price and then sell as many as you think you can. If you want to sell more, you have to drop the price in order to sell more. So that's the idea of being able to be a price setter. Now we go to the next sort of more market concentration, more market power, which is oligopoly, which is few large firms dominate the market. They are also experience product differentiation. So Toyota truck is different from a GM truck and so forth and so on. So there's some variation in products. But the biggest characteristic is that few firms dominate the industry, such as automobile, steel, oil, airline, those type of airline manufacturing, those type of things. And so in this case, you also experience high market power. And because of the high market power and product differentiation, consumers also experience downward sloping demand curve. And then the last to the other extreme is monopoly, which is a single seller. In this case also, the monopoly is a price setter, which again means that the demand curve is downward sloping. Because a single seller and consumers don't have many choices, then the consumer price elasticity is lower. So therefore, that means that the demand curve for a monopoly is steeper than a monopolistic competitive, where there are a number of choices. You can go to Wendy's or to Burger King or McDonald's or Chick-fil-A, wherever. You have choices. But when it's a single seller, you don't have many choices, and therefore the demand that consumers face is less price sensitivity. But nonetheless, this monopoly is also a price setter, which means that they can set the price, and then that will determine how much they can sell. If they want to sell more, they have to drop the price, etc. So we're going to spend a little bit of time, even though your book doesn't, on the concept of monopolistic competitive industry, and then cover the monopoly and then make a comparison as to why we don't like monopolies, particularly because they're harmful to the society in terms of the quantity of the products they produce, and the prices that they charge tend to be always more expensive and less available. We have another category of market structure called natural monopolies. These are like utilities: water, gas, cable, etc. And they're natural because it does not make sense to have multiple vendors of gas, for example, or electricity in a neighborhood, because everybody has to pull their lines or cables or pipes, and if they were to serve only a limited number of consumers, the average cost per consumer would be very high. So as a result, usually government gives the status of natural monopoly to a single firm, and in exchange they will be regulated. So they have to submit their cost structure in order to be permitted to raise rates on consumers for gas, electricity, and so forth. So we're not going to discuss that very much. I'm going to discuss this. We already have talked about competitive market, which is the basis of market economy and so forth. Not capitalism. Capitalism is a sort of a concentration of capital. In the market economy, nobody's big to do anything harmful to the consumers. Monopolistic competitive is interesting because we buy more products that are produced under monopolistic competitive, where there's a product differentiation and some similarity, but also multiple choices. Then we buy under perfect competition, and we don't have many monopolies except natural monopolies. We have near monopoly firms like Microsoft and so forth, but we have antitrust laws to prohibit monopolies to form. Oligopolies is a little complicated to kind of discuss. I'm not going to spend much time on that. But let's spend a little bit of time on monopolistic competitive firms. As I said earlier, monopolistic competitive, they have product differentiation, meaning that the products are not identical like the competitive market, and relative ease of entry and exit. And so therefore sellers are price takers. So that leads to a demand curve that is downward sloping, as we said earlier, and then given that the demand curve is downward sloping, every time you want to sell one more unit, you have to lower the price. But it just turns out that you don't lower the price on the last customer, you lower the price on everybody before. Because remember, when you set this price, some customers will find it acceptable and buy. When you drop the price, then other bunch of customers will find it acceptable and buy some more. But if you are selling to customers and you decide to drop the price to a lower level in order to sell more, you have to drop the price on everybody else who was willing to pay more. But because you lower the price, everybody gets a lower price. So therefore, the marginal revenue curve, it looks like this, is under the demand curve. Marginal revenue is additional revenue. Marginal revenue is additional revenue when one more unit is sold, except that you have to drop price on all the other previously sold units or would have been sold units, and that's why the marginal revenue in this case is below the demand curve. In a case of a competitive, this was demand curve, what was also marginal revenue curve. Demand and marginal revenue were equal because every time you sold, you got the price. That marginal revenue never changed. In this case, marginal revenue does change. In this case, you have also a marginal cost curve, additional cost of producing one more unit. Obviously, it rises because resources are becoming less productive as you try to produce more, and so therefore marginal cost will rise. Then you have the average cost curve. Okay. Now the rule, okay, the question is how much do you produce for profit maximization output? What is it? Well, the rule is you produce up to a point where additional revenue, marginal revenue, is equal to additional cost. So here, marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. That will tell you the level output you must produce to be profit maximizer. How much do you charge? Well, you trace it to the demand curve, and that tells what customers are willing to pay. And how much is your profit? Well, you at this level of output, your average cost is here. So this is your average cost. This is the price. This is basically revenue for selling one more. This is cost on average. So the difference is profit per unit, or this rectangle area, is the profit, total profit. Per unit times the number sold will give you the total profit. Average cost times Q is total cost, and then price times Q is total revenue. And then if you subtract total revenue from total cost, you end up with this rectangle, which is the profit level. And this, like, because there's an ease of entry and exit into the market, if there is a profit experienced, let's say hamburgers, people hear that people are going crazy over hamburgers, and people say, no, I'll quit my job and open a hamburger joint. And so that attracts more suppliers. And so as that happens, let's say this marginal cost is also a supply curve. As more people into the market, supply shifts to the right, and the average price drops. And so in that case, some of these people with a high average cost cannot make profit, and they are kicked out. And those who can make some profit will obviously stay. So long as these people can really convince that their product is better through differentiation, advertisement, campaign, and so forth, they might be able to charge 10 cents, 50 cents, dollar, $5, depending on the product, more than the competitor, because they convince you that they're better. McDonald's constantly advertise to tell you that they're better and more flavorful, etc., than the competitor. And if that's the case, they can charge you 50 cents or a dollar for the same thing. Chick-fil-A, for example, advertises itself as a not a fast food, but fast served restaurants. They in fact have people come and greet you and say, anything I can do, just sort of try to say, hey, I'm not the same run-of-the-mill hamburger place. We are more classy, etc. If that's the case, you might be able to extract another 75 cents or a dollar out of the customer. So there is an in and out, and eventually there will be some profit left, obviously, but has some characteristics of a competitive market. We like it, essentially. And they can set prices, but they cannot set prices way out of the sort of norm, in other words. So it's not a bad deal. Fast food, a lot of personal hygiene products, toothpaste, soaps, etc., etc. Restaurants, pizza places, these are all examples of monopolistic competitive industry. And again, there's some positive attributes. These people can differentiate and therefore charge a little bit higher prices and use that to develop new products, new ideas, new decor, etc., etc. Because these people are very similar, they spend tremendous amount of money on advertisement. Ad expenditure on these people is extremely high. They have to constantly advertise in order to remind the customer of the product variation or product differentiation, in order to maintain market share, etc. And so it's not a bad idea, except that sometimes these ad expenditures excessive, and they pass it on in the form of a higher prices to the consumers. So that's the downside of it. But nonetheless, there's some degree of competitiveness, and we like that aspect of it. So that's essentially a monopolistic competitive market structure. Now let's go to the other extreme. As I said, for some of you who showed up a little late, we talked about this market spectrum or market structure, where the environment in which they operate. From one extreme was a perfect competition. We already discussed that. Then we moved to a little bit less competitive environment, where it's a monopolistic competitive. And then oligopoly, where a few large firms dominate the market, like auto, steel, oil, airlines, airline manufacturing, etc., etc. And then you go all the way to the other extreme, where it's a monopoly and a single seller. So we want to discuss monopoly, not because it's worth much, other than to show you that there's a reason why monopolies are not desired. So there's a single seller and high barriers to enter. Sometimes these barriers are legal, sometimes technological. Not everybody can get in the business, like space technology. It is so complicated and so expensive that is not really open to everybody. It just needs a very advanced technology in order to get in, and nobody has it. It could be other things like property or property rights, like De Beer, the diamond producing giant. They own a lot of mines, and so nobody can really compete with them that much because they own it. So therefore, the reasons that entry into this position would be difficult, high capital requirements. To become a sole seller and to be that big, you need to have a massive amount of capital, and that's not available to many. So therefore, they do exist not in the US theoretically. We have a lot of near monopolies, but really no monopoly for products and services we buy, because we have laws against it to begin with. And as because they're a single seller, they have market power. And if you have a market power, that means the demand curve that your customers face is downward sloping, like monopolistic competitive. And so they are price setters, meaning that they can set the price and then consumers will decide how much to buy. They can't twist your arm, although in some societies, I've heard like in some neighborhoods, rough neighborhoods in Brazil, there's a local grocery store or convenience store that is owned by the gang or the mobs, and they better not catch you shopping somewhere else. They will not only are monopoly in that stretch of the neighborhood, they force you to buy. In the US, even if there is a monopoly, they cannot force you to buy. Let's say even in the case of natural monopoly, your utility company is a power company. You don't have any obligation to have electricity running through your house. You could switch it or turn it off and discontinue service, either live with candlelight, your own generator, or however other alternative. They cannot come and force you to purchase. They have to set the price so low that it would be inconvenient for you to go and buy your own generator and go every time buy kerosene or gasoline and fill it and crank it in order to generate your own power. In recent years, more and more people are installing solar panels that generate electricity for their own use and maybe sometimes surplus that the law forces these companies to buy back. Except that now they have taken this issue to court and say that if everybody or a lot of people set up their solar panel and become power producer, and let alone that they want to send it back into the grid and charge us for it, they're not our customers. And who's paying for all the infrastructure that we have to pull in the neighborhood if more and more people just become generator and they're not picking up the tab on the infrastructure to even buy back the power from them? So they're now going back to the courts and saying that if you install your own solar panel, you still have to pay certain fees just because you are going to feed back into the network, and therefore we've got to charge you. That kind of thing. It's kind of still is a debate. So anyway, so in that case, because you have to drop the price to sell more, marginal revenue is now different. Every time you want to sell one more, you have to not only drop the price on that last unit, but every other person who buys. So you have a marginal revenue that is below the demand curve, and is similarly downward sloping. And like before, we have the average cost, and then we have a marginal cost. Very similar. And how much do they produce? Well, let's say they're profit maximizers. They produce at the level where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That's the output associated with profit maximization. How much do they charge? Well, you trace it to the demand curve, and that's the price they can charge. That's the price of a monopoly. And what is the profit? Well, what is the average cost for this level of output? Is right here. So you trace it here, that's average cost, and this would be their profit area. Price minus cost is what's left over times the quantity. That basically says profit per unit times the number of units, and therefore that gives you the profit area. Now, why don't we like this? Well, let's assume, remember when we had the perfect competitive market, we said there is a market. All buyers and sellers interact. All collectively, buyers have a downward sloping demand curve. Collectively, all sellers have upward sloping supply curve. There is a market equilibrium price, and then individual sellers have to accept that. Right? But nonetheless, this is the market for competitive industry. These are individuals where the demand curve is perfectly elastic, meaning consumers have many choices and they never pay anybody a penny to buy because they go to the next vendor. But the market as a whole and the consumer as a whole have a downward sloping demand curve, meaning that collectively, if all of us to buy more of whatever tomatoes, you've got all tomato sellers have to drop the price. And the supply is upward sloping is because doesn't matter individual or collectively, as more resources are sucked into production, they compete with each other for labor, for land, for other material. Costs will go up, so the price must go up to encourage them to be in the business. So let's do this. Let's assume that monopoly is sort of a collective version of a perfectly competitive. So we have this demand curve. Monopoly demand curve and a competitive demand curve, let's say, collectively. And then you have the supply curve for a competitive, and this is a supply curve for a monopoly. So if the demand and supply intersect here, this would be the level of the output if the industry was competitive. And you could see that if the industry was competitive, it would make more products and services compared to when they are monopoly. And then the equilibrium price would be here. This is competitive price. So therefore, if we broke up a monopoly into a bunch of small competitive firms, consumers would get more products at lower prices. So this is the justification for antitrust laws. These antitrust laws are not only applied to monopolies, but to near monopolies. That's why AT&T and T-Mobile merger was denied. I think American and US Air did merge and did not face regulatory obstacles, so they're effectively are one company, and eventually logos will all change and so forth. But there are times that the government will step in and prevent merger of firms because they will reduce consumer choice, and the reduction in consumer choice will result in a steeper demand curve. This is when you have a lot of choice. This is a case when you have many, almost infinite choice, but this is increasingly less choice, where your price sensitivity is greatly diminished. I can raise price and you cannot drop the product because you don't have place to run. In a case of a competitive, you obviously run right away, you would not even hesitate. And in a case of maybe when you have some choice, so you show some price sensitivity. Okay, and but when I create this steep, very steep, means that you really don't have much option in terms of change in consumption. So that's why we have antitrust laws to discourage concentration of industries, because in that will lead into consumer uh, disadvantage. In late 80s and most of the 90s, many of the large banks pushed the government to allow them to go interstate. Bank of America and then Wachovia and now Wells Fargo bought up a lot of smaller banks everywhere from coast to coast. And now effectively most consumers have very limited choice in banking. And as a result, fees have gone up, and interest payments on savings and so forth have dissipated. So it turned out that arguments that they had made, that by allowing mergers and interstate banking, they will be more competitive, it turned out to be actually less competitive. It was obvious to the naked eye, but that is a case of a political, sort of a political economy decision, as opposed to the strict government argument. There is, however, a very interesting argument for large production operations, and that is called economies of scale, where you can expand production and the cost will drop. These are short run average cost. So if you expand production and every time you can extract more out of your resources and you bring the cost structure down, short run average cost can fall. And so if you connect all these bottom points, you get long run average cost. And as long as this is dropping, that means expansion will drop the cost. Except that when you expand to this high level of production, you might have eaten up a lot of competitors along the way and knocked them out. These are many production by many small, but if you suck those up into your organization and or kick them out and replace their production with yours, you can bring your cost structure down as you expand, but at the end of the day, you have less competition in the market because large producers have destroyed or absorbed smaller producers. So that's why we have actually the case of natural monopolies. Like utilities, the reason we allow one producer to be so large is because we believe that they can bring the average cost down, and hopefully they pass that reduction in average cost in the form of a lower prices to the consumers. Whether that happens or not, of course, has to do with government regulations and so forth, and whether they can go and look into their books and whether they're transparent, etc., etc. And sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, and sometimes they do pass on the lower cost of production to consumers, and sometimes they don't. Banks didn't. They expanded, became giant banks. Their data centers, their marketing, mortgage to households or firms consolidated, so you could put mortgage products out there. All of those consolidations brought the average cost down, except that they're not passing it on into a form of a lower fees, etc., etc., to consumers. So, but that discussion is there. Sometimes it's good to allow economies of scale to happen, as long as you know that it's going to destroy the competition along the way as well. All right, so That pretty much wraps up the conversation on monopoly and why we don't like it, and how is it harmful to the welfare of the society. Microsoft has been declared a monopoly in Europe for a long time because they refuse to open up their source code so that others can develop applications that would run smoothly on Microsoft operating system Windows. And so they have slapped them with hundreds of millions of euro of fines and penalties in order to force them to open up the source code, but they haven't. And I don't know whether they really have paid any, except that they've imposed that on them. In the US, we effectively have left them alone and hope that Google will break the back of Microsoft, or Apple will do such thing, etc., etc. And it turns out that actually it has the appearance that these people are trying to eat each other's lunch and compete, but at the same time, these large giant IT companies are buying up every possible new ideas that any person has. They pay top dollars and grab that idea or patent, and they have accumulated thousands of patents each. All of this is designed to discourage anybody entering into their domain because they own the patent. Somebody came up with a clever idea, they pay him a few $1,000,000, suddenly a kid is millionaire and he doesn't care what happens to the consumers. So therefore, but the downside of it is that they have become so huge that nobody for a foreseeable future will envision broadsiding Google or Microsoft or now Apple. It just has become like a technology feudalism where few people own all the land and nobody can become a small farmer kind of thing. So anyway, so that's the conversation that I wanted to have about the monopolies, and I'm gonna just pause here for a second to see if you guys have any question related to this conversation. Of course, monopolies have a large assets and market position, and so some research and development does take place, although they really don't have much incentive because they're sole seller. And why to spend too much money on research and development if nobody else is going to come on board and hit you on the side and steal the market? However, if you are a monopoly and this is your average cost, you have some incentive to to bring the average cost down, because with the marginal cost being here, this is the price, and this would have been a profit before. If you can engage in technological improvements that bring your cost structure down, then average cost before for this level of production was here, now is here. So you can have higher profitability. That's the incentive you have to engage in product development, technology, and so forth in order to bring your average cost down to boost your profitability. But you have no incentive to pass this part of this cost savings to the consumers, and that's why we don't like them, because there's nobody competes. Because usually, if there are competitors and one of them figures out to bring the cost down, two things can happen. One is that nobody else is up to that idea, so they add to their profit margin. But if others can quickly get on board and figure out what they did and copy it, they will pass on some of the cost savings through lower prices to the consumers and force everybody else to do so. Monopoly is not competing with anybody, so even if they figure out ways to bring the cost down, they have no incentive to pass it on to the consumers in the form of lower prices. Okay. Any questions at this point? All right. Now I'm gonna spend more time on chapter 9, the role of government in economy. This is a very hotly debated topic. There are people who adamant that government should stay totally out of the economy altogether, so, with the exception of national defense. And small little things here and there, and everything else has to be left to market mechanism. Why? Government is incompetent, they do crazy things, they set prices that is not aligned with the market forces, they redistribute from wealthy to the poor. If they're engaging in education, they screw it up. If engaging in anything, a lot of people really strongly believe that almost anything the government does ends up in higher costs and lower services, etc. And they're passionately against the role of government. In fact, in recent years, in the case of even military, people extended this argument of anti-government argument and created actually military subcontractor contractors who were former military people who got together and say, you're gonna invade here, give us some, certain price, we'll do the job for you. Or you wanna run supply lines to some parts of the military operations, give us some money, we're just outside contractors, etc., etc. So there's even some movement to even take the military or national defense and hand it over to private contractors, kind of thing. But nonetheless, despite of all these arguments, etc., the share of gross domestic product that goes to government in US is roughly 40% of the GDP. In many of the European countries is in excess of 40 to even 60%. In Northern Europe, Scandinavia, government is 60% of the economy, except that they're mostly local, and what they collect, they spend it on people in form of high quality education, high quality healthcare, good public transits, good public safety, etc., etc., etc. And then when they retire, they provide them with a decent retirement arrangement. They don't have to struggle to make sure that they have decent accommodations or healthcare when they get old. But they pay taxes in order to receive all of those. So there's less resentment, although I've met some who are highly resentful that they pay high taxes and they're not sure what they get in return. And there are those who are convinced that they are getting value for their taxes and they're not objecting to it. In other words, they're not packing their stuff and going somewhere else because they look around and feel that is a good place to live, in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, those places. And yes, they have good quality care for the poor, etc. But that they consider that as part of their social obligations, etc. So nonetheless, there are some distinct occasions where you cannot really avoid the role of government. So let's look at those issues as what are the goods and services that we have no choice often but to let government to get involved with. All right, so one area of the role of government is in terms of resource allocation or a strategy in the economy. For example, the US needs to reindustrialize. Pretty much everybody agrees to it, except that individual producers are more interested in profit, and they want to take the jobs to China or elsewhere to improve their profit margin as they bring the cost structure down. And so if we wait for all these people to eventually wake up one morning and say, okay, enough is enough, we got to do something, it may not happen. So, for instance, when we started this course, we said, all right, there's an economy where we could have, let's say, computers or all other goods. So we could take all the resources and produce nothing but computers and zero on food and clothing and homes and transportation. Or we take all the resources and sink it all in production of all other goods and no computers. Or most often somewhere in between that gave us this sort of a concave curve saying that, okay, we can allocate resources between these two choices. Whether we go all the way there or we go there or somewhere in between is a matter of the national strategy. But let's say that if we left the choice between these two category of goods to the market, profit motive may drive a lot of producers to this option: heavy production of computers and not much of anything else. And yet the society cannot cook computers, to eat, except that profit margin on food and other stuff is lower than a computer. So therefore, we need to be maybe a more balanced mix of all other goods and computers, but this will not happen if you left all producers to their profit motive devices. And so this would be optimum resource allocation and production of goods. This would be suboptimum. A lot of resources are sucked into production of computers and left the society with not much else. And that is not a good outcome, but you can expect individual firms to pay attention to that, because say people pay me top prices for computers, that's what I shall do, and go buy your stuff, whatever we're not producing, and go import from somewhere else. It's not my problem, that kind of thing. So therefore, when government gets involved, usually is a result of what we call market failure. Markets fail to allocate resources correctly and fails to allocate output or distribute correctly. For instance, the market may create an environment that we have a 1% getting 40% of the economy in homes and vacation homes and yachts and private jets, this, that, the other thing. And then everybody else has to scramble for what's left. So therefore, some would argue that that's not a good market. If you left it to market forces, some people have market power and they suck resources toward what they are interested in, and then they accumulate wealth and they alter the outcome of the society in terms of the distribution of resources, where they need to go, and in terms of the distribution of the output. So that's really one area that we have this question that there's so much debate, and it's been historic forever and ever. People argue that, but really at the end of the day, it's not about government, because we can't live without government. Imagine societies like Somalia, which is a failed state. There is no government. How many people want to live there? So some government is necessary to maintain law and order, to create safety so people can get up and go to work without the fear of being shot or blown apart. That's requirement in order for an economy to function properly. So, and you can't expect private uh, agencies to provide all of that. There is a reason that they won't do it, and we'll get into it very quickly. So let's look at the category of goods that will fall under public goods. Okay, this is public goods versus private goods. When is a private public good? When is a good a public good? One of the characteristics that a good has to have is a non-exclusionary rule or condition, which means that once the product is produced, I cannot exclude anybody from access, such as public park, such as good quality air or quality water, or fire protection. Once I protect one home, I end up protecting all the homes around it, etc., etc. So therefore, I cannot exclude some people and put a gate that say you didn't pay, and therefore you can't use. If I cannot exclude anybody from access, let's say neighborhood park, anybody who wants to come in, they can walk right in, then that leads to the problem of free riders. People who cannot be excluded from accessing certain products or services, but they're not paying taxes to provide them. So therefore, if there's a problem of free riders, because you cannot exclude them, then it has to be produced through taxes. You have to tax people in order to build a public park. You have to tax people to build the national defense. You have to tax people to provide some basic infrastructure, because once the road is there, it will be incredibly difficult for stationing a police or somebody and check every single car and then pull them to the side if they don't have the sticker that they pay taxes for the road. It just administrative cost of managing that is so humongous that it's better to build the road and let everybody ride on it, and then build it through taxation. As soon as you have the tax issue, somebody has to tax you, then you lead to the presence of government. That's one case of a public goods that brings about the interference or role of the government, and so therefore, when it is a non-exclusionary rule in effect, private market will not respond correctly. What is a private good where you can exclude people? You pay for a hotel room and they give you a key, which means not anybody else can walk into that hotel because you paid for it, and they will exclude everybody else. They have ways to exclude others. Nobody can walk in. How about the activities of the Center for Disease Control? Well, there's an outbreak of virus somewhere here or in other part of the world. They will go and figure things out as to what's the source of it, how to fix it, how to prevent it from spreading. How can you price it? How can you find a company say, well, I will control it, but fine, once you control and this virus doesn't spread, everybody benefits, and you cannot go around and charge everybody 50 cents or $1. And that's why nobody would be interested in activities that Center for Disease Control performs. And that essentially becomes a public type of a service that has to be provided through taxpayers. Okay, so that's sort of a one argument. The other argument for government role is externalities, or sometimes referred to as spillover. Okay? They can be positive externalities or negative externalities. What are the examples? Well, positive externalities is like education. Well, let's first say, what are the externalities? These are costs or benefits to those not directly involved with production or consumption. Okay? So, you smoke a cigarette, you're involved with purchasing it, smoking it, enjoying it. But what about the secondhand smoke? This person has nothing to do with you, and then you make their life a little bit complicated or difficult. They have to go somewhere else, they have to keep a distance, they have to leave the room, they have to leave the bus, whatever, and you impose a cost to these other people who are not involved with you in any way, and yet they have to suffer the consequences. Coming to the positive externality, education is an example. You get education, everybody around you who had nothing to do with your education will benefit because you're a better decision maker, you're more competent, you are more aware, you are a better citizen, etc., etc., etc. So therefore, education that you acquire obviously benefits you in the form of to become a better citizen or better, maybe earn higher wages. But that doesn't end there. A lot of other people will benefit from you being educated who don't even know you. Another example would be health. If you're healthy, you don't communicate diseases to anybody else, you're productive, you pay taxes, you show up to work regularly. People who don't know you somehow benefit from your activities, your production, your engagement in the labor force. They benefit from taxes you pay so that they get other products and services through your tax contributions. So therefore, spillover of education and health are positive. And that's why governments are involved everywhere in the world with both education and health. There are those who argue the government should stay out of education because it screws things up, or there are people who say the government should stay out of the health and health provision because anytime the government steps in, things go wrong. But nonetheless, because these two products or category of products have positive externalities, if you left it to the market forces, poor people may not educate their children because it's too expensive at the market prices. Going to school is expensive, so they will tell them just go hang out in the streets or go figure out become a beggar or a vendor or something. They don't send their kids to school if they were to pay market prices for education. So what happens? Well, that positive spillover will not happen. These kids may run into all sorts of problems and in fact create all sorts of issues for everybody else. So good education becomes positive externality. No education actually can lead the person into criminal activities or low productivity, etc. And the burden will be carried by everybody else. So it becomes a negative externality. That's why governments want to make sure that citizens consume more education than otherwise they would. So what does that mean? Well, okay. If market will not encourage as much consumption of a certain product that we know has positive spillover or externality, we want to encourage it. So this is, let's say, amount of education. Sought. Okay, this is their price. Right? Let's say going to school for everybody is priced so that's availability. That's the price. If it's determined by market forces how many people seek education, at this price it may be above what many poor people can afford to send their kids to school. and so therefore demand will be here by all those who can afford it. So this will be the amount of education that the society will consume or will seek. But we know that this is not enough. We need more of this because the spillover, the positive spillover, spreads throughout the economy and will have long-term positive implications. So therefore, we subsidize education through taxes or charity, and therefore this will be the demand. This will be the demand for education on market price, private, marginal benefit. You decided I want it, and it margin every time I get one more degree or one more pass one more class, I get additional benefit from it based on that compared to the cost of it or price of it. And then I would say, all right, this is how much education I'm going to get. But this may not be the level of adequate education the society as a whole needs. It needs more educated people, but it's not going to happen at this price. That's why the government will subsidize the consumers in order to boost the demand for education so poor people can send their kids to school, and this would be the social demand. Okay. So therefore the social demand is greater than the private demand at this price, and therefore some subsidy on the part of the consumers will happen. They keep the price down in order for others to also join the education market. Same thing happens for health. Quantity of health consumed, and this is price. Let's say average price of seeing a doctor is here. If that was the case, some of us will go to a doctor, but this is not sufficient amount of health consumed at the society level. A lot of people need to consume more health because we need them to be healthy to go to work and be productive and have a normal lifespan, not to at age 23 or 45 to become disabled and become a public charge. We need them to be healthy. So therefore government is involved in Medicare, Medicaid, etc., to increase the demand on the part of the poor or the elderly to consume more medical care. Because again, health care is considered to be a positive spillover type of a product. Now, what if it's a negative externality? Such as secondhand smoke. Okay, and there, if I have a car that is a gas guzzler, I'm polluting the air in the area a lot more than somebody who's walking or riding a bike. So their health is affected by my consumption. If I am running a power plant that is not equipped with environmental protection devices, the emission of toxic gases and so forth can travel sometimes hundreds or thousands of miles, get with air current, get mixed with the clouds and come down in a form of acid rain, and create all sorts of environmental issues for people who are not even remotely close to where this power plant is located and where the customers are. Years ago, the coal power plants created a lot of emission that was full of sulfur, and then got mixed with the rain and then came down in form of acid rain, and much of the New England and part of Canada forests were dying because of the excessive acid in the rain. So all of those are examples of negative externalities. So negative externalities have social cost. Everything you produce has private cost. And what are they? Well, labor, material, etc., etc. You pay, write a check for people you hire, material you buy, energy, etc. And so that adds up when your accountant writes a check for all of these. That's your private cost. And then you mix all these things to produce, let's say, some rubber shoes. And except that when you produce rubber shoes, it pollutes the air. So therefore, often production has private cost, but also has social cost, such as air pollution, congestion. You build a factory and you congest the roads all around you. And all those people who live and have homes take longer to get in and out of their neighborhoods, etc., etc. So therefore, you're causing air pollution, you're causing congestion, road congestion. You may have noise pollution, you name it, all sorts of things. So imagine somebody bought a condo overlooking the bay, and then you come and build a apartment right smack in front of them and destroy the view. And they paid $1 million for that apartment in order to have the view of the bay, and then you come and build something in front of them and destroy that view, and suddenly their apartment is now worth half the price. So who's going to pick up the tab? I mean, so that's why they go to court, and either they prohibit construction of that new condo high-rise that will destroy the view of the previous high-rise, unless they pay him equal to whatever damage or loss of value is going to be experienced as a result. So therefore, this tells you that when we produce many products or services, there is a demand, which is the marginal benefit, private. There is a marginal cost, which is a supply curve. This is private cost. And if this were the only forces at work, this will be a market, and this will be the level of output produced, and this will be the price. But what if this product has side effects, has harmful characteristics? Some people who are not involved with the purchase of this product will suffer from it. Imagine there's a paper mill, and there's all sorts of obnoxious fumes that is emitted into the air, and everybody who owns a property around it, they have to basically abandon their backyard comfort and go and close all the doors and windows and run air conditioning all year round to prevent this obnoxious fume to bother them. And yet they're not even working for the paper company, or they're not even consuming their products. And so as a result, there is a social cost. Marginal cost, social marginal cost associated with it. So it's not only private, but it's also cost to the society. Some people are suffering and either pay in a form of inconvenience and or health issues, etc., etc., respiratory problems, cancer that may happen as a result. I mean, you hear all these fracking issues that, yes, these companies are drilling and paying for the land and all the other material, but once the water wells are contaminated, then people suddenly have to buy bottled water, or have to put filtration, etc., or the property value plummets because the water nearby is contaminated and nobody wants to buy their property to move in. So therefore, there is a social cost. Now, If we force these companies identify what those social costs are and calculate it, sometimes difficult, but if we calculate it and force them to internalize externalities, means that suck it up, pay for it, absorb it, install devices to minimize or eliminate the gases, build additional road or widen the road at your own expense in order to reduce congestion. All of that are social component that we force the private producer to absorb it into their cost structure. If that happens, so you have social cost plus private cost. If I add up the two, the total sub-marginal cost will be here, which is this one plus that one. So now this is the demand curve. Look what happens. This will be a new equilibrium. Quantity will be less than if we did not force these companies to absorb the social cost component of their activities on the supply side, and the price will be higher, which is essentially what policy makers want. They want products or services that have noticeable, significant, measurable marginal cost component to absorb and pay for those. And once they do that, the cost structure will go up. Supply shifts to the left. This is a supply curve, as we have said before. And if that's the case, the equilibrium will happen to at a lower level output, and the price will be higher than otherwise. And so therefore, that's the outcome we are seeking. Good example is tax on cigarettes. People demand it. There's a production of cigarettes, except those who consume cigarettes will run health risks, and then everybody else's insurance premium or taxes have to go up to take care of them when they come down with all sorts of health issues. So therefore, private consumption of tobacco has social costs. And that's why we go to the tobacco or cigarette manufacturers and impose tax. This would have been the number of cigarette packs sold at this price. When we impose tax on the seller, the cost structure will go up, shift the supply to the left. The new equilibrium of amount of cigarettes bought and sold will be less than before, and the price will be higher than before. And that is precisely the reason that eventually, after 40 years of argument and courts and debates, we were able to use economic theory to prove that some form of action needed to take place to discourage consumption of cigarettes. We couldn't ban it, but we said we would tax it. And so, of course, that's the idea there. As the price goes up, demand on the part of some people will drop, and therefore less is consumed. Okay. If a product is so harmful, the tobacco is a gradual harm. But there are products, let's say some pharmaceutical, if you consumed it a couple times, you have a birth defect when you get pregnant. These products, the social cost is so heavy, is in fact way up here. Maybe cost penny to produce it, but people who consume it will suffer irreversible damage. And so in those cases, we tend to shut the product down completely, because by the time you take the social cost or social damage to the consumers, plus what it costs to produce it, it will be so huge that it will be has to be astronomically priced, and therefore the best is to just shut the product down. In some societies, like most of the Northern European and Central Europeans, they take social cost issue very seriously. And therefore, the products that are allowed in the US are many of them totally banned in Europe, just because they consider the social cost component very high, and therefore they ban it altogether. In some societies, there may be somewhere in the middle. In some societies, the social cost is not even considered. When we ship the used computer components to some remote areas in the world where they inhale all the toxic gases as they melt and separate the precious metals out of them. Those people suffer uh, irreversible health damage. But nobody cares because we essentially pass on that social cost to people who don't know how to compute it, or they're so desperate that they cannot afford to worry about the social cost, and they only worry about what it costs to hire some people and give them some torch and say melt these motherboards and extract the precious metal out of them, and all the fume that comes from burning plastic and polymers, and some of these are extremely harmful and they don't get respiratory devices to protect them, etc. So that's why some of these production activities that had high social costs, such as environmental damage, we ship them to other parts of the world because those social costs were not computed there. Increasingly, we compute them here. So we send them to other parts of the world where they don't know how to compute it, or they just can't afford to compute. Because if they did that, the cost will go so high that they cannot produce much of what they do, and the price will be so high that you would not give them the project. So that might as well not do it. So that's the conversation, or the second reason that we have government involvement, either to encourage. Now, what if the production of a certain goods are beneficial, such as education or to train doctors? Let's say there's a quantity of physicians trained, and this is what it takes tuition. Let's say this is the price. All right. The society needs physicians, so the demand is there. If you left it only for people who can afford to go to medical school, only this many people will go to medical school. This would be the quantity of physicians produced, and this would be the tuition they pay. And only extreme wealthy parents can afford to send their kids to medical school. But the amount of physicians that it produced at this level is not going to be adequate to provide medical care to hundreds of millions of people. So therefore, government gets involved in subsidizing medical school education, which means that they pay universities to open medical schools, and they pick up the tab for the building and facilities and professors and so forth. So therefore, this would be the supply only in a market force. This would be supply with government subsidy. So what's the end result? We produce more physicians, and the tuitions will be affordable to a larger number of people to attend. And so this is a case where we subsidize the producers to produce goods that have positive externalities, or we tax them to shift the supply to the left to discourage products with negative externalities. Okay, so that's reason number 2 that we have governments involved. Okay, and your book talks about how we could impose taxes, and that will shift the cost structure upward, and therefore, when I This is an average cost. This would be average cost with regulation. And so therefore, firms with a marginal cost going through here, and the demand curve, you can alter what is profitable and what is produced and how much of it is produced. So you can look at figure 9.4 for a detailed discussion of this conversation. The third reason, so we had basically, one reason was presence of public goods, non-exclusionary, you couldn't exclude people, so it has to be produced by public. The second was the presence of externalities. And the third reason is market power. We talked about monopoly. Monopolies have huge market power and use the market power to produce less and charge higher prices. That's why governments get involved in making sure that monopolies are not formed through antitrust laws, etc. Because if you left it to market forces, a monopoly will emerge. One large firm will eat up the competitors, force them out or buy them out, and eventually become a single seller. And we showed theoretically why single sellers produce less and charge higher prices. That's why we have government and antitrust laws. Without government enforcement, it would be very difficult to prevent some industries to be controlled as monopolies. Okay. Now, the fourth reason that we have government involvement in economic activities has to do with inequity, unfair distribution of products and services. Now, there are some people who argue there's no such unfair. Let market forces will, through supply and demand, determine who gets it and at what price. And those who don't qualify, tough luck. If they don't have this price, because the market demand is willing and able to pay. That's how demand is formed. You must be willing to consume the product and also able to pay. So what happens with the poor? People who are poor and yet must go to work and they need transportation, but they can't afford private car. What if there are certain people handicapped, born handicapped, went to war and came back handicapped, etc., etc. If you left this to market forces, someone who was wounded and lost an arm or a leg or this and that as a result of combat, they can't ever compete fairly with healthy people for most of the jobs. So therefore, it is a question of fairness or equity that in most societies will eventually bring the role of government into the picture. Now, how much government or what kind of government? There are some countries where government is accountable and is quality. Example, I was traveling in Germany, and a professor who was with me said that after a visit with the hospital with students, as a token of appreciation, he sent a couple bottles of wine to a couple doctors who made a presentation. And a few days later, he got a phone call and said, well, how much was those wines worth? And he had to tell the price. So 2 weeks later, he gets 2 bottles of wine, different kind, and with a note saying that we do not accept any payback for what we do. The president of the country in Germany was forced to resign because he had accepted 2 days of a vacation at a friend's home, vacation home, without paying the person. and they are so adamant to make sure that nobody has any kickbacks, any kind of favoritism toward political figures, that even something as small as that was enough for him to be forced out of office. That's a case of a good governance where corruption is low and people trust the government, and the government is not a revolving door between the private sector who go and penetrate, or lobbyists and so forth. So the government is accountable. Then we have corrupt governments in places such as Somalia, if there's no government there, but Zimbabwe and zillions of others, where the government is not accountable, etc., etc. So all of these conversations with respect to public goods, because there are a lot of people who say that make most highways pay toll highways, let people who ride, and then, but nonetheless, still government has to provide those secondary roads for people who don't want to pay and enjoy the high speed convenience of a highway. So therefore you have one super highways with the gates you have to pay to get on, and then you have secondary roads where it's slow and a lot of traffic and lights and so forth. But nonetheless, the government, at least very minimum, has to provide the secondary roads free of charge to individual users and supported with tax money, and externalities, market power, and so forth. So some of these are subject to heavy debate, depending on the person's political persuasion and philosophy, and it varies from society to society, and is all dynamic. There's nothing set in stone. To give you an example, after the Second World War, hundreds of thousands of people returned from war. They needed to be trained so that they could be employable outside of the military. So therefore, public education, university education, was something that the government had to put together in order to absorb tens of thousands of veterans to make them engineers and teachers and so forth. So what was basically a very private opportunity for those with affordability to go to private colleges and universities now opened up as public good. We needed them. There was a positive externality with more engineers and teachers and doctors, and therefore government got involved in building state universities and educate large number of workers. Over time, some economists or people looked at this phenomena and say, okay, this is life, years, this is wealth. Two people start with equal wealth. One goes to high school only, and this is the projection of wealth growth by the time they reach, let's say, age 65 retirement. This became the projection for those with college education. This was high school. All right, they looked at this data and said, what's wrong with the picture? Why are we providing subsidies to people to go to college and they become so wealthy and let them pay? So as a result, we slowly removed government programs to support families to send their kids to college, and say borrow or private savings. You can either give up your vacation or your new car and send your kid to college, or just enjoy life and let them finish high school. We'll give you a high school education, but nothing more than that. So based on this projection, a lot of money pulled out of the college education because they figure that this needs to be privately funded. It doesn't make sense that we give them, we throw in the government money at it. So a lot of loans basically became the rule of the game. Now, fast forward 40, 50 years later, well, we don't have enough engineers compared to China or India and many other places in relative terms. In India, they produce 125,000 computer engineers per year. and probably is more than that nowadays. We, at some point several years ago, the statistics was that we produced 60,000 in all engineering fields. So this is 125,000 in computer engineering alone. We produce 60,000 for all fields of engineering. Well, guess what? 10 years forward, these people will have several 100,000, if not in excess of million, would hardly be in a low 100,000 and so forth. So therefore, what does that do? Well, competitive uh, position will be lost. That's why now the government has slowly come back in. They try to keep the interest rates under control. Government has taken over some, what I understand, over some of the student loan programs, because they want to make sure that the interest rate is affordable. And even if people have to borrow, they borrow at the more affordable rate as opposed to what the banks would have charged on their own. So there are subsidized student loans for college education, because now what was one time badly needed public good became slowly private good. Education is a good, right? Now we're slowly coming back to consider education, college education, to be an interest of the country, and increasingly more value on the public arena, and so therefore some subsidy and or support is required because the fierce competition from other parts of the world. So these are the reasons for the role of government. Now, I'm going to quickly, any questions at this point? I hope I didn't put you guys to sleep. All right. Anybody else? I hope, because that I'm recording didn't mean that you guys can just take off. But anyway, let's discuss some of the questions for discussion. Page 202. Question number 1. Why should taxpayers subsidize public colleges and universities? I just answered that question. Because of positive externalities or spillover related to education. Okay, what external benefits are generated by higher education? Well, better management decisions, better citizenship. People who are educated don't vote for a politician because their wife is nice. They vote because they understand what they're talking about, if they're educated. They don't vote for a politician because they just tell you all kinds of nonsense on ideological grounds. You can examine critically and say, well, does it make sense? Is it deliverable, or is it just a false promise, etc.? So you become a better person. You can raise better family. You can help your kids to become a next generation successful people. You can at work make better decisions, and in your public life you can be more responsible and more a responsible citizen, and more participatory in the world around you. So that's why. Number 3. If you have questions or objections or other points of view, please feel free to step in. Could local fire department be privately operated with services sold directly to customers? What problems would be involved in such a system? Well, if it was privately sold, the fire department will quote you a price. Some in the neighborhood can afford the fire department protection for that price. They get it. Fair enough. Now your house is on fire. They can quickly see on the radar it is house paid for fire protection. They come and take care of you and put the fire out. Except that when the fire breaks out, the chances are that it will spread to the houses surrounding areas. Well, what happens to those homes? Well, since they didn't pay, they don't get covered. And what if the house next to that one is covered? Well, that fire is going to spread to the house next to it. So they suddenly realize that it is so complicated, let alone they cannot contain the fire and not spread to the homes and so forth that didn't pay, and or try to figure out whether they are up and current on their pay for the fire protection. That's why the spillover, negative externalities, spillover of a fire and costs to the neighborhood is so high and is not manageable. You cannot exclude. You cannot exclude the protection. Once they are coming out and put out the fire for the house that paid, the house next to it that didn't buy the fire insurance benefits because fire didn't spread, and therefore, but yet they didn't pay. They were free riders. So that cannot be, and that's why if you left it to market forces, people wait for everybody else to buy fire protection and hope that they benefit from them, and that's why the whole thing falls apart. Question number 4. Identify a specific government activity that is justified by each source of market failure. Well, here, for example, one market failure was public good, and government is involved in parks or highways, because you cannot exclude people. Another argument was externality, and then in that case we had situations with pollution control, etc., etc. Another had to do with market power. Economic activity that government does is usually prohibit use antitrust law to prohibit monopoly formation. And then was inequity. Government involved in education for the poor, healthcare for the poor, maybe housing subsidy for the poor because you don't want them to be out in the street with their children, so you have to provide them with some housing. All of these, of course, abuse and all that does happen, but nonetheless, these are different examples that government is engaged in different activities resulting from 1, 2, 3, 4, a combination of these market failures or sources of market failure that government gets involved. Okay. All right, number 6. Does anyone have an incentive to maintain auto exhaust control device in good working order? How can we ensure that they will be maintained? No, really not everybody, because if your catalytic converter is bad and we don't require inspection, you don't incur several $100s of expense to get it fixed. Why? Because you drive around. The pollution is always behind your car, not in front of your car. So you don't suffer the consequences. You just drive around and everybody's driving behind you or walking or jogging behind you, get the toxic fumes in their lungs, and yet you're long gone by then. And so therefore, why to incur an expense where you don't suffer the consequences directly? And that's why people will avoid it. That's why we have in most states emission control inspection, and you better pass it or they will force you to repair it. And how can we ensure that they will be maintained? Well, again, by imposing taxes if you didn't. So either we penalize you or pound your car down or would not let you drive around. That's the way that will force you to internalize the externality of poor emission that your car is imposing on everybody else in the society. That's really the idea there. And number 9, 4 companies produce virtually all breakfast cereals. How might this concentration of market power affect market outcomes? What should government do, if any? So if there's a high concentration, which means consumers don't have many choices of breakfast cereal, therefore these few firms can get together. That's the case of an oligopoly. Few large firms dominate the market. When you have only limited choices, consumers they face inelastic demand curve. Okay, and so whatever is a supply, cost of production of these breakfast cereals, at the end of the day they can charge higher prices than if they were competitive, efficient firms, because when firms are efficient, forced to compete, if you remember, in a competitive firm, the marginal cost is the supply curve. And as more firms enter, the price will drop. Only those firms with competitive cost structure will survive. In highly concentrated market, firms do not have to be very efficient in what they do, and therefore they can actually have a very steep supply curve. Consumers don't have a place to run. End result is high prices. In a competitive world where there are many breakfast cereal producers, the marginal cost and average cost will be the lowest, because this marginal cost keeps pushing the prices down, and only the most efficient one can survive the low price and stay. All these people have to exit, and so therefore the consumers will benefit from a good product at the lowest price possible, which is equal to the cost of production. High market concentration end up with consumers not having a choice to exercise their options, and the suppliers do not have to be very efficient, and therefore the price is higher and the product will be lower than otherwise. Highly competitive industry will bring a lot of suppliers, because entry is easy. Supply curve will be way out here, price will be considerably lower, but not in a concentrated industry. All right. That's the questions for discussion. Any questions or comments? I hope you're all comfortable. I'm sure when I explain these things, things make sense. I hope you find these conversations worth your while. And I don't know whether I have assigned questions. Let's go back to question on the chapter on monopoly. And I think I had assigned question 5, 8, and 9. I'm not sure. I have marked it in my book, so I'm assuming that I have assigned those. Let's just, for the sake of completeness, do them anyway. Number 5, why don't monopolies try to establish the highest price possible, as many people allege? Well, you're a monopoly, demand is inelastic, the highest price is here that you could set if you want to. This is how much you sell. Well, that's fine, but what if they have a capacity and they want to make more, and maybe they're not even profit maximizers, they're revenue maximizers. So therefore, it is in their interest to drop the price and gain market. So the fact that monopolies are price setters doesn't mean that they always seek the highest price. They want to at the same time sell as many products as possible at the profitable prices. So they're not interested in destroying their own market. That's why they won't set at the highest price, but their price that they set is higher than a competitive uh, market structure. What happens? What would happen to sales? Well, if they set at the highest price, the market will be smaller, and they don't have the power to go and twist your arm to purchase from them. The profit also will be lower, especially if the monopoly has given them very much a cost advantage. They own all the land, and so they're very huge. The cost is very low, and so the profit margin can be significant even at low prices. So why not to take advantage of that? So that's why most people think that monopolies are the highest price. No, they're higher price than a competitive firm would charge. Question number 8. What entry barriers exist in the fast food industry? Well, fast food industry, you have to have a place, rent, license to sell food, etc., etc. But they're not that great. But there are certainly there. Very minimum, most municipalities, you have to be licensed food seller. You have to be inspected. You have to have minimum set of equipment before. You have to have maybe a minimum number of parking spaces if you're a restaurant. You have to have a certain amount of facilities, laboratories, etc., etc., in order to open up the door as a restaurant. Cable TV, much higher barrier to enter, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of cables, a lot of technology, a lot of stations, customer service, billing departments, etc., etc. So therefore, barrier to entry is higher. That's why you have limited cable TV providers in the country. Recently, Comcast has put in the request to buy Time Warner, and regulators are looking in to see if this is a good deal to let them do it. They want to combine, not because they compete in the same market, but they want to combine in order to have a bigger muscle against content providers, because they have to negotiate with local TV and others and so forth for the shows that they carry. If they are bigger nationwide, they can bargain for better prices for both of them to carry than if they were separate as cable companies. So the question is whether they can convince regulatory agencies to let that happen. The oil industry is even more. You have to have a massive infrastructure, assembly lines, design, development, maintenance, parts, customer service, finance, etc., etc. So it's a much. That's why very difficult to become an auto manufacturer. Excuse me. And finally, illegal drug trade. Well, entry into that. If here is, I don't know what they mean by trade. If you are like a large kingpins. That recently one of them got arrested in Mexico. These are multi-billionaires. They have network of distributions. They can enforce their laws through execution of those who cross them, etc., etc. And so to become a large illegal drug dealer or trader, you have to have massive number of people who support you. You have to have some territories where people benefit from your. In fact, when they arrested this Mexican guy who's a very massive global drug dealer, a lot of people who benefit from his operations actually took to the streets and protest in his support, because he provides them with livelihood. So I'm not an expert. I suppose you can be illegal drug trade business probably with less complications than to open a assembly line. But I think their operations is very complicated. What I understand, some of them are extremely smart, and not everybody can have that level of operational competency to distribute, carry, distribute, collect the money, deposit, launder the money. They do all sorts of things that even big corporations are not capable of doing. And for that reason, I guess you could say that only a limited number of people can enter. And that's why there are turfs and wars among these drug lords throughout the world. Okay, so with that note, I am done. The exam is posted. I hope you've had a chance to look at. Research if my lectures have not quite provided all the answers. Think through, and I wish all of you much success. In the meantime, feel free to email me if you have questions. I have to have the grades in by Monday, so try to get them to me as soon as possible. And between now and when I see your exam and so